Here we find two large tobacco barns and a smaller building that was used as a tobacco stripping room. It is a modern landscape where you can still see signs of the rural past. Tobacco has not been grown here for over 10 years, but the land is still in the hands of the family that farmed it in the 17th century. Tobacco was king in Calvert County and has always been referred to as the money crop. An extremely labor-intensive crop, tobacco shaped the county and the country more deeply than on an agricultural level. It had a huge effect on the social and economic fabric of Calvert County. The tobacco barns are among the last remaining symbols of what was once the economic heart of the county. Farmer and Judge Perry Bowen Jr. talks about the early barns and their uses.
Generally speaking, the farms in those days had one principal barn, a cornhouse or meat house. The barn consisted of a section stable with a hayloft over top of it, and then it had a shed generally with a southern exposure that was open. One shed had what they called a prise in it, which is a machine for putting tobacco in hogsheads, which is the way all tobacco was shipped in those days. It was all shipped in hogsheads to the Baltimore market. The rest of the barn was devoted to curing tobacco. Actually, the way tobacco was raised had changed very, very little from colonial days.
Tobacco is a tall, leafy plant that belongs to the nightshade family, a relative of tomato and belladonna. The colonists grew a strain of tobacco called Orinoco. This was the tobacco of choice, highly regarded and in demand overseas. After 3 centuries, a few southern Maryland farmers still grow and harvest a modern strain of Orinoco, now commonly known as Type 32. It is slow and even burning and is used primarily in European markets and as an additive to domestic cigarettes. Some consider it the finest in the world. You can hear the pride in Earl Buddy Hance's voice when he talks about Maryland tobacco.
I mean, Type 32 tobacco, the old type Maryland tobacco, is the finest tobacco in the world. People don't believe that, but other than a cigar wrapper that's grown under shade, the tobacco we grew in southern Maryland is the finest in the world. It's thin, you can hold a match to it and light it and it'll continue to burn. No other tobacco will do that.
David Conrad is the University of Maryland Extension tobacco specialist and author of The Tobacco Handbook. He talks about Maryland tobacco more clinically.
Maryland leaf has a high filling capacity and it has a mild aroma, and it has, of course, the components of usually low alcohol and low nitrogen. A high filling capacity. You can get a lot of cigarettes out of 1 pound of tobacco. Maryland tobacco is a light, airy leaf, and by using it as a component, they can produce more cigarettes out of 1 pound of tobacco. A tobacco that would be a dense leaf, a heavy type leaf, you may not get as many cigarettes out of a pound, and that's usually the basis by which they compare it back to 1 pound cigarettes per pound. But also you may get a tobacco that, since it's that heavy, it might be strong aromatically, it might be high in nicotine or something like that. But the Maryland leaf, for the characteristics used overseas, was that it had a high filling capacity, and that when mixed with other tobacco types, they could produce a lot of cigarettes per pound of leaf. Had a fine aroma, and that normally was related to the lower end content, which is physiologically, Maryland leaf on a dry weight basis is 3.5% nitrogen. So if you're around 3.5% nitrogen or less to 3%, that they like that. That seems to produce a real nice aroma. If it gets much higher than that, it's a strong aroma. If it gets too much lower than that, there's no aroma to it at all.
"50 acres was about the minimum size for a tobacco plantation in the 17th century. Tobacco took a lot of time and energy to grow. In fact, almost everyone on the plantation might help with the tobacco crop, especially on a small plantation. Plantation owners who could afford help would bring indentured servants from England. Later, they would import slaves from Africa or the Caribbean. Most servants coming to Maryland, especially men, were brought to help with the long, hard task of growing tobacco. Tobacco seeds are very small. If you wet a pen and stuck it in a jar of tobacco seeds, you'd come out with 100 seeds. The growing season started in February or March, when the tiny tobacco seeds were planted in a small patch of ground called a seed bed. As the seeds began to grow, they would have to be watched very carefully. If it got too cold at night, the plants might die, so they were covered with pine branches to protect them. While the plants grew in the seed beds, the fields were prepared. After the field was cleared, planters piled up the soil into small hills with a hoe. When the tobacco plants were large enough, they were transplanted into these hills. The plants would take the rest of the summer to grow. Plants had to be watched all summer in the hot Chesapeake sun until they were ready to be harvested. Late summer or fall was harvest time for the tobacco crop. The entire stalk of each tobacco plant was cut at the bottom and allowed to wilt in the fields for a few hours. Then a hole was pierced in each stalk so that it could be threaded onto a long stick, a tobacco stick. Perhaps as many as 6 or 8 stalks could be put on each stick. This would require huge amounts of manpower. These sticks were then hung in tobacco barns like these to dry for 6 to 10 weeks. Cassandra Parran Briscoe comes from a tobacco farming family with roots as long-standing as the tobacco economy of Maryland. You don't have to read between the lines as she talks about her personal experiences with tobacco farming.
Well, setting out to plant them, keeping it hoed and cultivated, topping to take the flowers out before you cut it. And then the big one is the cutting. Before my time, when they used to hand plant all the plants, I guess that was pretty backbreaking too. I believe that the hardest part of raising tobacco is the cutting. You go through the fields with a tobacco knife and take 2 rows at a time, whacking them off and throwing them together. And you go through and after it wilts down a little bit, you spear it onto the tobacco sticks. And then it's put in piles, and you come through and load it on trailers and take it to the barn and hang it. The cutting, bent over, continuously cutting is hard, and the spearing entails reaching down to your feet and picking up the stalk and slapping it down on that spear. And so, and ordinarily this is August, and it's very hot, and it's very dirty work because the sand sticks to the tobacco. And there's a great deal of tar which gets all over you, which makes the sand stick to you, and the whole business is, I think, hot and hateful actually.
By the late 19th century, the barns had multiple adjustable boards called air doors built into the walls that could be partially opened so there would always be airflow for curing. Once they were dry enough or in order, the plants were taken down and the leaves were stripped from the stalks. Planters made sure to do this on a rainy day so the leaves were not so dry that they would crumble and break. Originally done in the barn, stripping was later moved into a separate building like the one here. The leaves were bundled into hands. A hand was a bunch of 10 to 20 leaves wrapped together. These hands were packed into very large casks called hogsheads and readied for shipping. A hogshead could hold between 300 and 500 pounds of tobacco, depending on how well it was packed. Tobacco was a lifestyle and a ritual in Calvert County. You can hear the sweat and toil in Helen Gray's voice as she reminisces about her experience growing tobacco.
I used to go there. I had to draw the plants first, pull your plants up. Years back, we used to plant by your hand, plant tobacco. Turn around, then later years, they had tobacco plants that you could sit down on and drop them in. I couldn't get too much used to it because I hate the low ground. Then after that, they made them that you can sit up in the high seats and drop them in the clicks, but like this. Well, all you had to do, pick your plants up out there, out your lap where you had power, and drop them away like in the plant of this gold and stick them in the ground. I love that. I drive tractor, cut tobacco. When they come out in bloom, I had to go and walk through the field and break all the tops of it, you know. And then let it stand for so many days. Then you go back and you take your cut knife, strip it, hang it in the barn, go up and take it down. Plenty of days, 7 and 8 ties up. I climb it, drop my back down. Ain't had nobody help me then. Drop it down, big high power, and get high, get down, put it in a bulk. Or take it, you know, lay it down flat like that. And then I turn around, and when I get enough there, I take my plastic and cover it up, you know, so it wouldn't dry. Then I had to go in there and get it out. Carry it in my stripping room, light my gas stove, pull it off myself, and sit down and strip many days by myself. I get it stripped, a great big pile, get up and hand pile it up. I ain't just gonna work, but I love it. I love it.
Modern times greatly changed the way tobacco was farmed, but there still was a need for significant manpower to raise and harvest the crop. We'll talk more about labor and its role in the eventual demise of tobacco in Calvert County in a later section of this tour. You may not have time to see it as you drive by, but directly across the road from the barns, there is a modern house that replaced one built in the 18th century. There were a number of slaves working this property at the time. They probably built the original house, and those who worked in the house lived in the attic quarters. The story goes that one of the slaves living there, upon hearing of the emancipation of slaves, fell to her death from the balcony while dancing with joy on the very day of Jubilee. This sad story has been passed down through people who claim her as an ancestor or relative. Please continue 4/10 of a mile past the barns and make a left on Maple Road